Alright, so this is an informal review, or unofficial review, or whatever you want to call them really. I don't really have a great name for them. Either way, essentially what it is a review slash opinion piece style of content in a live format. The reason I sometimes like doing these is because there's way more games that I would like to talk about than I have time to cover, especially if I need to write something like a script and edit a video and so on and so forth. Basically as simple as that. So it is a very casual style of content. It doesn't have any scripting or anything like that. It's pretty much live, me talking about the game and telling you what I think about it and kind of showcasing how it plays. It's pretty much as simple as that. Mostly unedited for the most part. I think that's a reasonable way to showcase how a game looks when it comes to playing it. Usually try to avoid things that are very spoiler heavy. There's sometimes a little bit of spoiler, I guess, but if there is the option, I usually tend to do side quests and so on and so forth to not ruin that all too much there. That's pretty much it. So how I usually like to do these is that I first take a quick look at the option menu. I usually like doing that, or I usually like knowing how that looks for a PC game. Both because PC has a very large, wide range when it comes to hardware, so it's nice to be able to tune it to what your PC can handle and to be able to know what you can tune it to and how much you are able to customize it to your liking. And also just because I like being able to customize my experience, quite frankly. And I think it's a bit unfortunate that console games are so bad when it comes to that, but there you go. Guess that's one of the benefits of playing on a PC, I suppose. Anyways, I'm gonna have a quick look at that, then I'm gonna jump into the game and kind of show you what it's all about and tell you what I think about it. Pretty much as simple as that. So let's start with having a quick look here. Well, actually, come to think of it, maybe I should tell you a little bit about what Shadow Warrior 2 is first. So, Shadow Warrior 2 is an FPS looter shooter. It's quite a contrast to the previous Shadow Warrior remake released in 2013, I believe, which was very much an arena-based FPS. It wasn't really that old school, because the old school games like the old Shadow Warrior and Doom and Hexen and such that was released in the 90s, they really weren't arena-based. They were just normal linear or just kind of semi-linear FPS games, essentially. Non-linear, I guess, to some degree, but it varied a little bit between the different titles. The Shadow Warrior remake was very much a arena-based game, almost to the degree that you see in games like Painkiller, I guess. It's very strict. It would really strictly lock you into an arena and completely, well, hinder you from progressing until you kill all the enemies. This one is very much the polar opposite, quite frankly. This one throws you into really big open levels where you can explore and screw around however you want, really, within the confinements of the game mechanics, obviously, while completing some various objectives that they give you. Could be something like killing a certain amount of enemies or finding a thing or destroying something or whatever, right? Some kind of quest, essentially. So yeah, that's what Shadow Warrior 2 is. You're always gonna see a little bit more clearly what it's all about when I jump into the game, but that's probably a good thing to preface a little bit first here before we look at the option menu. But with that said, let's continue with having a look at the options here. So the options for this game is actually rather exhaustive. There is a lot of options. This is only the HUD options, by the way. And there's a lot to be able that you're able to customize here. You can customize color and scale and alpha of the crosshair. You can have the opacity and scale of the HUD, what you want in way of hints and information from the enemies and so on and so forth. You can hide the HUD entirely. You can turn off the crosshair if you don't want it, just make it invisible. Yeah, so there's a lot of customization options here. Melee steering. This is basically how the melee acts in the game, how the kind of mechanics of the melee works. So on advanced, it will be based on how you move your camera. So if you move like left to right, you're probably gonna be slicing your sword left to right and so on and so forth. If you put it on like casual, it's just gonna be randomly selecting different angles. Basically as simple as that. Auto change, I think that's just changing the weapons, like when you run out of ammo and so on and so forth. And if you pick up a new one, I would guess as well, yes. Weapon inertia, this is how the weapon follows your screen. So there's a bit, when you have high inertia, there's a larger delay on the weapon following your screen. This makes it look a little bit more smooth and less mechanical. I don't like having it too high because I don't like having my arms flinging around when I'm moving around my camera a lot. I actually find it rather annoying. But I think about 10 is reasonable. It looks a little bit more natural still, but it's also not annoying in my opinion. I also enabled subtitles because that's kind of nice when you are doing this kind of streams, in case I talk over the the dialogue, you're still able to see what they say, in case you're interested in how the narration and dialogue and so on and so forth looks in the game. Language is English. There's a few different language options as well, which is kind of nice. Yep, that's pretty much it. Don't really think I changed anything. Undo. I don't think I changed anything. If I did change something, I probably don't want to keep it. Video options, basically everything you would desire here. Resolution, scaling. You can turn on and off most options here. Motion blur, which is something I don't like. I can easily just turn it off. Depth of field. Chromatic aberration. That's how it's pronounced. Yes. Film grain, bloom, so on and so forth. Everything is customizable here. Basically, there's nothing I see that I would say is really missing that I can think of here, honestly. So it's a very nice option menu. FOV slider, of course, is always nice to have in an FPS game as well. So yeah, everything looks good on the video front. Audio, fully separate audio settings here for SFX, music, and voice. Yeah, all of those are nice. Actually, I can just increase this a little bit, I think. 20? Yeah, that makes sense. You can force stereo in case it doesn't detect stereo, I suppose, but it already has, so that's fine. Yep. Sure, I want to keep those. So yeah, audio options really nice. Mouse and keyboard fully rebindable, and sensitivity options. You can also invert or smooth your mouse. I don't know whether you would ever like to do that, but there you go. If you for some reason would like to torture yourself, I guess you can do that. And then we have multiplayer options. This is just a skin. If you play in multiplayer, you can choose which skin you want to use. And color, of course, as well. If you play single player, this is completely irrelevant, doesn't do anything. It's a first-person game. You're never gonna see your character anyways. Lastly, we have these things. So this is the difficulty. You can change these at any time. This is very much a co-op focused game. It's not co-op focused in the way that you have to play it as co-op, but I would say it's kind of the same as in Borderlands, I guess, where it has a reasonable focus on co-op and definitely wants you to play in co-op if you have friends to play with, I guess. It's very much intended to be able to be played in co-op at least. It's not an afterthought, let's put it like that. Yes, so the base difficulty, obviously this is basically like adjusting the difficulty for the amount of players and then the difficulty for those players, right? So this is medium for 3 players. This would be medium for 2 players. If you play with 2 players and play with 4-player difficulty, and medium here is probably going to be very difficult. So that's how that works. I'm going to play single player though, and I'm playing on hard, that's fine. Sometimes these kind of games get kind of bullet spongy when you play on the highest difficulties, I tend to find, so I think hard is completely fine. It still has a bit of a challenge, so it's alright with me, I would say. It also have a load backup save, which is kind of nice. There's a bunch of backup saves. I don't know if they ever, like... I assume they have to remove them at some point, but it certainly has gathered up quite a few here. But yeah, it is nice to have those though, in case the game screws up in some weird way. I don't know. Or maybe if you just, I don't know, made a bad decision with a weapon that you didn't like, I guess, maybe, or something. I don't really know. But it's nice to have it anyways. It's nice to have these with when it comes to games that has autosaves, because otherwise you would be kind of screwed if you're like, well, I didn't like how I completed that, I want to replay that. Well, you can't unless you have one of these. Obviously, you're like, oh, well, you restart the entire game because it's already autosaved for you. It's like, oh, well, that's fun. So that's nice. I do like that. Anyway, so I'm about 50% into the game, so that's a pretty reasonable point, I would say, to showcase what the game is all about. I will have access to most weapon types. I have most abilities. I think I have all abilities, magical abilities, and a decently leveled character as well, so I think that's a pretty reasonable place to showcase the character. So yeah, I think that pretty much does it for options and menus. So without any further ado, I'm gonna just jump into the game and show you what's going on. When it comes to performance, this game does totally fine. I had no issues with any kind of stuttering or frame drops or anything like that. And I am playing pretty much on the highest settings, with the exception of resolution scaling, which I'm currently not doing anything with. I'm neither upscaling or downscaling anything in that sense. In addition, the game has almost never crashed. There is actually one issue which makes the whole freaking game just freeze up and crash, which is really stupid. Probably gonna show you that later. But aside from that, it has not crashed. It's pretty stable. So here we are. Welcome to Shadow Warrior 2. So the way I'm gonna structure this, I think, is that I am going to firstly go through kind of the more technical aspects of the game here. So the things like weapons and upgrades and shops and missions and kind of how that works. And then I'm gonna jump into a mission and also gonna switch to post commentary because of two reasons. One is that I've noticed the bleed through from my keyboard and mouse is rather excessive, and that kind of problem is exacerbated when you are doing more hectic combat. So that's not ideal, basically. That's rather annoying to listen to. The second reason is that it is also a pretty hectic game, which means that, well, my ability to provide even moderately coherent commentary and analysis would be severely hampered, let's say, and hindered when I'm trying to multitask in that sense. So I think that's a reasonable way to structure it. So let's just start with the shops, because these are pretty simple. Basically in the shop you can buy gems. I'm gonna go through what these are. Weapons. Sometimes there's weapons available. If you purchase all of them, there's not gonna be any more, so you know, there's just a certain amount of weapons that are sold here, as well as some ammunition. I've never had to actually purchase ammunition, honestly. You're basically always gonna have a decent amount of ammunition, at least of one type. If you don't have of one type, say for example right now I don't have that much heavy machine gun bullets, is what this is. Well, I have a lot of all the other ones, so yeah. I've never actually had to purchase ammunition in this game. You can also reset your skills, as well as restock the shop or reset the shop or whatever. So that's pretty much that. It's very simple. That's the shop. Now, when it comes to weapons and equipment in this game, you can at any given time have 8 weapons assigned to your number keys, but the amount of weapons you have in total is much greater and much larger. So as you see here, these are all the weapons I've collected throughout the game, and as I showed, I'm about midway through. So all these weapons use a certain ammunition type, obviously, firstly. So you have shotguns. This is like a plasma, which is one of the weirder ammunitions. These are light machine guns, revolvers or pistols, so on and so forth, bolts, etc. The reason why plasma is kind of weird because they are used by very different types of weapons. The same goes for batteries. So this one, for example, this is like an ice bolt shooting pistol rifle thing. This one is like an electric arc weapon. They both use this battery thing, right? When it comes to bolts, all of these uses bolts, but they're all bolts, bolt weapons, right? They all use kind of shoot bolts. This one doesn't. This one kind of shoots ice bolts. This one isn't a bolt in any way. This is just like an arc that's projected in front of you. You can show it in fact. Yeah, like that. It's pretty different. So yeah, they are like more varied in the types of weapon they power. All weapons will have 3 sockets. These sockets can be filled with gems, which are these things, the upgrades here. These gems essentially give stats to your weapons that are gonna primarily determine the power of the weapon. There's a bit of a benefit and kind of drawback, I guess, to this. In comparison to something like Borderlands, where the kind of stat is inherent to the weapon itself, the stats in this case are more so, albeit not entirely, a result of the gems that you have socketed into the weapons as opposed to the weapons themselves. Now, the weapons themselves do have a kind of stat, but they are more equivalent in power overall. So, if you look at these, for example, all of these 3 weapons are all pretty much equally viable to use, for the most part. In fact, if I remove these, 91, 84, 83. So all of these are kind of viable options, honestly. These 2 are slightly better, but they are also a little bit different. This one has a higher rate of fire. This one has a much lower rate of fire. The only one I would say is pretty mediocre is kind of the sidekick. It's a little bit worse than the other ones, but otherwise, basically all the weapons are completely viable to use for the most part, aside from a number of them, I guess. This one and this one, as you see, higher rate of fire, higher damage on this one, lower damage on this one. This one looks better, yes, the DPS. However, this one has this kind of bonus damage if you hit on a weak spot, which this one doesn't. So this one has another benefit, which this one doesn't, which kind of levels the power a little bit. But then there is a certain power rating dependent on if the kind of weapon is a rare weapon or a common weapon or a legendary weapon, right? Which means that the rare ones tend to be slightly more powerful. The benefit here is basically it provides more choice to you. You can kind of choose to use whichever weapon you want. If you really like the Twin Dao, you can use those. It's not like, oh, well, this Sword of Oni is much better, so I will have to use this even though this one is my preference. This is obviously a bit of a difference between this game and, for example, a looter shooter like Borderlands, where if you have a weapon that is more powerful, you probably just want to use that even though you perhaps do not prefer that weapon. And if you don't have a weapon of the type that you like, or at a power level that is appropriate, well, that's too bad. I guess you will have to try to find one. In this game, you can actually kind of adjust the powers of these weapons with the gems that you have, which is the primary kind of benefit of this system. One of the primary drawbacks, I suppose, is that it's much more exciting to get a cool, new, awesome weapon than it is to get like a gem with decent stats or whatever. It's not that interesting. You're gonna get a lot of these, by the way. I have 245 right now, which is like a ridiculous amount. At least 200 of these I am never gonna use. So yeah, you are going to be absolutely flooded with these things, and you are going to be basically selling a lot of them unless you want your entire inventory filled with crap. And there's really no reason to run around with 200 of these. It's just a while ago I actually looked through my inventory. What you do is basically just junk it, which puts them into the junk pile here, and then you sell them at the shop. Or alternative, you can sell them directly in the shop without junking them first. So yeah. And we have skills. This is basically the kind of RPG style of upgrades that you have for your character, leveling up things like HP, mana, your probability of finding ammunition, the force slash, so the kind of special attacks for your melee weapons, a bunch of different upgrades that you would expect from something like, for example, RPG games, just upgrading your kind of overall character power. Then we have these. So these are gems as well. It works the same way that the gems in the weapons do. They provide power, but they provide power to your character instead. So armor slots, these usually change things such as the find rate for various different items, as well as just obviously things like armor, resistance, health, so on and so forth. They can also give like regen and drain and stuff like that. We have this one. This is more like a major amulet for the most part. A major gem, but it's called amulet here. This one will significantly alter the way you play. This one, for example, this one completely negates all medkits, but it also makes your healing free. So it means that you're going to be healing yourself. You become a healing mage, but you can no longer use health kits in any way whatsoever. I personally prefer this one. I like the kind of firearm focus because I usually like to use firearms as opposed to melee weapons. Melee weapon or melee combat is a completely viable combat style in this game, kind of in the same way that it was in the first Shadow Warrior remake. The original Shadow Warrior, the kind of sword was more of a backup weapon, but obviously in the kind of remake from 2013, it was basically a fully fledged weapon, right? The same goes here. As you saw, there's like a large amount of different types of melee weapons as well. So there's multiple choices here as well. So melee is a completely viable strategy overall. Then we have these. These are just the basically magic buffing amulets, the gems, I mean. So you can buff your various spells. And then we have this one. This one really doesn't matter if you play solo. This is only gonna actually affect you if you are playing in a multiplayer / co-op game. If I, for example, add this one, resistance hour radius, still doesn't actually affect my radius one. Still doesn't actually affect my resistance, as you see. So these are really just important if you actually play online. Then we have these. This is just lore. We have some fortune cookies, which are basically jokes. Then we have these. These are just lore logs that you find throughout the game when you like kill enemies and stuff. And then you have tutorials. These are all the conversations. And then we have a few sentences about all of the different weapons and enemies as well. So that pretty much does it when it comes to weapons and upgrades and such. Let's cover the gems a little bit. So the gems obviously is the things that kind of gives the stat to the weapons. These can be everything from better reload speed or larger ammos and clips, more damage, higher damage against certain specific types of enemies, critical chance, explosion range, and etc. basically. Then we have these. These are a little bit more special, or whatever you want to call it. These kind of changes the overall nature of the gun to some degree. We have these, for example, which just makes your shotgun, for example, into a triple barrel shotgun, right? A lot of these also have some kind of negative stat kind of associated with them. This one makes the the handguns into a dual gun, but it also reduces the damage a little bit. Increases miss rate. This is basically the spread. It reduces the damage and increases the reload time. But at the same time, you obviously increase your fire rate rather substantially. Then we have these. These are also rather kind of special things, like, for example, making a non-explosive weapon into a explosive weapon. So making non-explosive bullets into explosive bullets. And there's a bunch of these different things as well. We have like scatter bullets or whatever. This one is piercing bullets. Here we go, flacking ammo. This one just splitters the bullet into several fragments. There's a bunch of different effects here. I'm not going to go through all of them. Lastly, we have the kind of elemental effects. Now, the elemental effects aren't super interesting. The biggest kind of consideration is if an enemy is strong or weak against a certain element, in which case, don't or do use that element. Basically, as simple as that. Otherwise, they don't feel all that different, honestly. They're pretty samey. The fire and the acid do damage over time. The ice and the electricity has a possibility or chance to stun. Otherwise, it mostly feels like visual flair when it comes to the difference, because, you know, obviously I have different effects, lighting something on fire or whatever, but otherwise, yeah, they don't feel extremely distinguished, at least in my opinion. But it's okay, it works, and it gives a little bit of variety in way of visuals, so. That pretty much does it when it comes to the sort of mechanics of the game, though. So without much further ado, I'm going to jump into this mission. So this mission is a Christmas mission. It's like the special Christmas mission they give you on Christmas, I guess. So that also means that this should have very little in the way of spoilers when it comes to just kind of story spoilers, so on and so forth. So it should be basically a pretty decent way to just showcase the combat and mechanics and stuff of the game. And then I'm probably gonna jump into this mission and like play a short amount of this, so that you get a bit of a sense when it comes to the kind of dialogue and how that one is delivered and structured and written and so on and so forth as well. But yeah, so without much further ado, I'm going to jump into this mission and show you a little bit of combat and gameplay. So let's do that. There we go, let's kill some bastards, shall we? There's actually a chest over here, so I'm gonna go loot that first. The chests in this game is not as important as they are in many other looter shooters, where they often serve as one of the primary sources of weapons. In this game, that's very much not the case. For the most part, what you get from a chest is just money and ammunition. I'm actually gonna change this spike pistol into the stapler, if you can just find that here somewhere. Let's see, it's a bolt gun, right? So that should be here. There we go. Stapler, replace the nail gun, and there we go. As you see, these are fire creatures or whatever. They are immune to fire, they have that stat, but they are weak to ice, which is why I used the stapler there, because the stapler had a ice modifier on it. And it is indeed the gems that determine the elemental effect of the weapon. There is no weapon that has an inherent elemental effect. All of them are customizable and they are determined by the gems that you socket into the weapon. So it's very much free for customization there. Oh, this is a weird one. Yeah, so this map has this kind of weird invisible wall here. I don't know why this is the case. I only found this on this map, but yeah, they basically just cut off this house in the middle. It also says it's a chest there, but yeah, I don't know what the heck that is about. It's such a weird thing. I guess they just didn't notice that they cut off the map in the middle of a house. But yeah, it's not a big deal, but it's just kind of bizarre that would happen. But anyways, whatever. As you see here, the kind of chests are presents as well. That's because this is like a Christmas mission, I suppose. You're gonna see how the chests usually look when I play the just normal mission. But yeah, that's just a temporary kind of skin for this specific mission, if you're curious as to why I'm opening presents. It is a Christmas mission, as I said, which is pretty cool. Has a few new unique visuals and such. Yeah, I really do enjoy when developers add these kind of like seasonal things, which are completely just voluntary on their part, obviously. There's no obligation whatsoever on the developers to add post content when it relates to various seasonal stuff, of course. But yeah, it's just nice. Anyways, let's just kind of loot this place and get all the gems and so on and so forth. Breaking some shit as well, of course, because why not? There's a lot of destructible environment in this game, as you see. You can break through windows. A bunch of the cars are explosive. That is actually a pretty core part of the gameplay, though, as you see that. The cars and various different interactable items around the world does act as explosives and just environmental damage, which is certainly worth keeping in mind, considering you can use them both offensively against enemies, and it's also not really ideal to stand beside a exploding car, so that's also worth keeping an eye on because of that reason, obviously. That car actually already exploded, so that's not going to be exploding again. There's no reason shooting that, but there we go. Yeah. As you see, there's a bunch of different types of things here. There's those explosive barrels. There is poison barrels and acid barrels and... Well, acid barrels and poison barrels. I don't know, those are kind of synonymous, aren't they? But yeah, there's like acid barrels, there are freezing barrels or similar things to that. Then there are cars, which obviously explode as well. And then a bunch of different type of pachinko machines, that's what you call, right? As well as just gambling machines and arcade machines and stuff like that. They also explode when you slice them and or shoot them. So they can also be used as environmental damage dealing entities, or whatever you want to call them. They are actually reasonably powerful and do a decent amount of damage, so they are actually worthwhile keeping in mind when you are in combat. They aren't just like kind of set dressing or whatever. They do actually have a determinative effect on the enemies and the combat outcome. Potentially, at least, if you use them effectively. So the combat in this game is very much arcadey, hectic, full-on action, obviously, as you see. There is no stealth or anything like that either. There is like a invisibility kind of ability that you have, but it is more like a temporary invisibility and sneak attack as opposed to actual like stealth mechanics in any way. There's a bunch of different enemies as you see as well, so it's a huge variety in both weapons and enemies. The weapons themselves do not feel especially impactful and meaty. They are not flimsy, but they certainly don't feel particularly heavy. It is kind of the same as it is for many different looter shooters as far as I'm concerned, or from my experience at least. The same goes for Borderlands, honestly. The weapons in Borderlands do not feel especially kind of impactful in the same way they do in games like Metro and Battlefield and really most pseudo-realistic combat games. That's a good reason for that. Usually the enemies are much tankier and more bullet spongy in these games, so that is one factor. There's a number of reasons why they can't really feel the same. You can't have as much recoil in a game where you have to spray the enemy with 26 bullets as you can have in a game where you can just shoot someone twice and they are dead. And it honestly wouldn't really make sense if they feel equally as powerful either, when you actually have to shoot someone 26 times as opposed to like 2 times. It just would feel very off. Personally, I really like when weapons feel really impactful and heavy. That's kind of my preference when it comes to games for the most part. But I don't really have anything against the kind of more arcadey style either. It's a different experience. Usually the arcadey kind of style of combat is more casual in nature and it's not quite as intense, while the more realistic 2 bullets and you're dead tends to be a little bit more tense and requires a lot of attention, and obviously reaction time is very important there. It obviously varies, but like in general that is kind of how it usually tends to be, especially in single player games. Or co-op, I guess, in this case. But yeah, player versus environment or player versus AI. It is pretty hectic though, as you see, and there's a decent amount, of movement and a decent moveset you have, that's for sure. I'd say this sort of shotgun does pretty well in tight corridors. I have to say, I'm pretty okay with that. Not an issue. Oh, there we go, one left. This is not going well. I think a shotgun is more appropriate in this close quarter, honestly, but anyways. Let's just collect these presents, shall we? Also, if you try to reload while full on ammo, you're just gonna flip someone off, by the way, because why not, right? That seems reasonable. Also, that's a very critical function in the game, you see. It gives you a sense of the comedy in the game, sort of. You're gonna get a little bit of dialogue later as well. I think I'm gonna switch out to a dual wield weapon as well, so that I can show you a little bit how that looks. I'm just gonna find one that would be reasonable here. Let's take this one. So dual wield weapons is one of the, dual wield melee is one of the 2 types of melee weapons in this game, essentially. It is dual wield, it's single wield, which is essentially like sword. And then finally there is a third one kind of, which is the chainsaw, but it's also incredibly simple, which is just you run it in front of you and rip things to shreds, basically. It's very simple in how it works, right? When it comes to the other 2 types though, they all have 3 different special effects or special attacks. It is those kind of shockwave things or shock slices things that you shoot out. That's the ranged attack on all of the kind of melee weapons. I'm just gonna change a few weapons here so you can see a few other variants basically, and kind of see how a kind of loadout or loading out a weapon and setting it up looks as well. There is these shockwaves you send out, as you saw. There is the kind of shoot right out in front of you with the kind of stab motion. And then it's the kind of spin around circular attack as well. Those are basically the 3 different special attacks all melee weapons have. And those melee weapons, or the melee weapons of the game, is basically the dual wield or the just single wield or whatever, right? The game has a rather large range of different melee weapons, honestly. There is quite a few, both dual-handed as well as single-handed weapons. At the same time, they do not feel especially distinguished. The different weapons do usually have kind of different animations, which is nice, depending on what kind of weapon it is. So, like, the claws has a different animation set than the, for example, dual swords, right? But then it's like the swords and the axes, they pretty much have the same one. But they don't feel especially distinguished, honestly. I don't feel like there's a really big difference between Claw 1 and Claw 2, or Sword 1 and Sword 2, or even something like a dual axe versus a dual sword, honestly. they also feel very similar in how they act and how they perform. And the kind of differences between them is rather marginal. There is no like really slow double-handed axe like you would find in like Skyrim or Dark Souls or Chivalry, I guess, versus like a dagger, right? That doesn't seem to really exist. It's like a fast or a slow broadsword, basically, yeah? There's no like, oh, this is a great sword which hits like once a second, or you can have like a fast short sword which hits like 5 times a second or whatever. They're all like, well, either it's 5 times or it's 4 times, basically, you know. So it's not a huge wide range. It doesn't feel like. At least I haven't found that. Maybe there is some hidden weapon somewhere in the game that have these kind of really slow and heavy kind of attacks, but at least from all the weapons I've found so far, which is a decent amount, I haven't found one that acts in that way. So if they are in the game, they've certainly done a good job in hiding them, I suppose. But anyways, there's different skins, essentially. That's kind of what it feels like, okay? It feels like there's basically a kind of, there's a claw weapon, and then you can apply a bunch of different skins to the claw weapon. Or there's like a handheld dual-wield weapon, but then it can be like an axe skin or a sword skin or like whatever, right? Now, some of the weapons obviously have like different stats, and some of them are a little bit better on delivering crits. Some of them have a little bit more damage against big enemies or whatever. So they are like specialized in that sense. But there's also a lot of gems that do essentially the same thing. I found a legendary sword that is pretty damn good, for example. So that one is just better than most other swords, but at the same time it feels the same as the other swords. Like mechanically it just feels kind of the same. It's just that it has better stats, or a special effect, I guess. But I don't know. It's the weapon, the meat doesn't feel very different dependent on which weapon you choose. I guess I can kind of sum it up as such. There isn't that much variety. Well, within the melee combat, that is. Then there's of course a large number of different guns, which do feel more distinguished and varied when you compare them between each other. At least in my opinion. I think that's quite enough about the melee weapons for now though, so let's kind of get back to what's actually happening. So as you saw not too long ago, I was kind of trying to use this kind of SMG as a dual weapon. I actually hate it. It does so little damage. I think it's because the SMG itself has really low base damage to begin with, and the dual wield, which decreases the damage while increasing the attack speed, well, it just decreases the damage way too much, so it just becomes functionally useless. But anyways, yeah, so I'm not gonna use that again, but okay. It might be more useful to have the dual wield weapons on the revolvers, honestly, or something that has a slightly higher base damage, I think. Since basically what you're doing is you're trading damage for, well, attack speed. That comes on to a different point though, which is that this game doesn't really have secondary fire. So if you remember from the first Shadow Warrior remake, most weapons had a secondary fire. So for example, the SMG had the kind of dual wield as a secondary fire. And we have the shotgun, which had the double barrel or the quad barrel, I believe, depending on the upgrade. And then we have all the other weapons. I think basically all the weapons had a secondary fire, honestly, if I remember correctly. So I'm not gonna ramble off every single weapon here, but yeah. Anyways, this game doesn't have that. Instead, all of the previously secondary fire modes has been relegated to kind of gem upgrades or modifiers. Which I really don't like that, honestly, because it means that in the previous game it kind of felt more natural and easier to switch between them, because you could just, okay, switch to alternate fire and then go back to normal fire again. And just switch back and forth very quickly. So it was a more fluid and integrated part of the combat, basically, in switching between the different modes. In this game, the kind of skill or strategy in switching between the different modes isn't really here anymore, right? It's absent. So it went from a part of the combat and a kind of ability to just a weapon choice. You choose either a dual wield or a non-dual wield weapon. In the previous game, the switching is part of the combat as well. So you would perhaps, for example, start off shooting normally with the handgun in the more accurate mode, and then you would quickly switch to the fanning mode when something gets close, fan off a few shots, and then switch back to the more accurate mode when the threat is eliminated and you want to have more accuracy. Or a very obvious example is if you're using the shotgun just normally, and then an enemy that's very threatening comes very close, you can just alternate fire and instantaneously empty out all of your barrels at once. The kind of quick reaction panic button. So in this game, these abilities just obviously isn't there. So if you want another effect than the primary fire for your current weapon, you just have to switch to another weapon. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of that change. I did prefer to have alternate fire as opposed to a primary modifier. It kind of removes an aspect or function in the combat and make it slightly simpler and less interesting in my opinion. That is definitely how you... You would never do that, right? That's, in actuality, obviously that's the sword animation of wiping off the blood of the sword. It just looks ridiculously silly and stupid on this hedgehog weapon, but whatever. Now, when it comes to the attack effects of the weapons, there is only one type when it comes to contact effect, and that contact effect is slicing. It does not have like blunt impact effects, so there is no weapon in the game that gives you a blunt impact. This weapon that I'm using right now, the hedgehog, obviously would make sense to have a blunt impact effect, right? But it still uses the same slicing effect as the sword. And secondly, as you saw, it actually just uses the sword animation full stop, which just kind of looks really weird, obviously. But anyways, there's a reason for why you don't have multiple impact kind of effects, and that's because it's a lot of work to make new effects for weapons. It's less work to just make a new animation sets for the hands. And that's partially because you have to be able to apply these effects to all the different enemies you have. So it kind of becomes like an exponential thing, because yes, you add one new sort of effect, say for example a blunt weapon effect, but then you will have to see to it that that blunt weapon effect works with every single enemy in the game as well. Generally through retargeting or transposing the effect somehow. And there's even more work if there's a bunch of different types of enemies as well. Since in that case you might not be able to retarget and transpose the different effects between the different enemies. So yeah, basically it can become quite a lot of work. At least if you want it to look good. Creating a new animation set for your hands, on the other hand, tends to be a little bit more self-contained in way of scope. But in this case they obviously just reused everything, including animation sets and effects from the sword. It looks a bit silly, but it works well enough, and as long as you don't have a strong emphasis on realism and authenticity, and you don't have too many blunt weapons, you'll probably get away with it. Okay, so lastly, there is a rather wide range of different weapons. There's obviously less difference between each category, so for example, most revolvers feels kind of the same or rather samey. At the same time, there's a decent difference between them. They have differences in things such as projectile travel speed and shooting speed, fire rate, damage, and so on and so forth, obviously. I also have to say that the kind of reload animation for the revolvers are pretty mediocre. I'm not entirely certain as to why that is. The action speed seems to be pretty much consistent throughout the entire animation, so that may have something to do with it. But I'm certainly not an animator, and I've always found it really annoying to work with animations and skeletal meshes and all that kind of stuff, so I don't really have the vocabulary or knowledge to eloquently explain what I mean here. Nor do I necessarily have the expertise and knowledge to pinpoint the exact issue either, for that matter, to be honest. All I can really do here is tell you how it looks and feels to me, frankly. It might also be a little bit of an overall thing, because some guns just don't feel particularly heavy or impactful in general, honestly. It just kinda looks light, I guess. It doesn't really feel like it's a big, heavy metal gun. It feels more like it's made of plastic or aluminium or something. Hell, maybe it is, who knows, right? But either way, I think it's a bit of a mix between a lack of anticipation, timing, and speed of the different actions. It really isn't a big issue. I'm just a sucker for really heavy, weighty reload animations. So, you know, Metro and Battlefield for me, I guess, but anyways. There are also a number of more unique weapons. There is, for example, the kind of arc fist or whatever. We have the kind of beam weapons. We have the ice shard or icicle shooting gun that I showed previously, slightly, I believe. I'm gonna show it a little bit more later either way. There's the kind of ray gun sniper rifle that I was using here. It's so there's a number of them for sure that are a little bit more unique or exotic, I suppose. So overall, there's a decent variety of different weapons. Some of them are admittedly much more enjoyable than others in my opinion. Certain weapons feel rather weak and flimsy. The SMGs, for example, usually feels rather meek and unsubstantial. It just feels like they have very little weight and impact. It's very much a spray and pray kind of weapon, and you really don't have to consider recoil control at all. It doesn't feel like they're firing bullets, it's more like it's spraying pebbles. At the same time though, there are other guns that feel rather impactful and satisfying as well. And additionally, the more unique guns are usually rather fun to use. But it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think that pretty much does it for the weapons and combat though, so let's move on to the kind of levels and environment for a little bit. So basically all missions takes place in these kind of large open maps, similar to the one that I am in right now. When you take on a mission, you're gonna be teleported to a random position in one of these maps and basically have that mission dictate whatever task you're supposed to complete. You're not able to complete multiple tasks at the same time. It's always just one core mission every single time. So each mission is self-contained. Multiple missions do take place in the same location. So each location is reused several times for multiple missions, which makes complete sense. They are rather large in size and very open in layout and structure. To use them for only one single mission, especially if it's a rather minor mission, would be borderline inane. But you can never complete multiple of them at the same time. It's always one after another. When you complete with one task, you're gonna teleport back, basically turn that in, and then you can go on to the next mission. But you can never take on two missions at the same time, even if they are in the same location. That's just how the game is structured. Which does make it feel slightly more artificial, but it's fine. It's not like oppressive and suffocating atmosphere and immersion is the focus of this game anyways. It's very much silly, crazy, over-the-top action, with a really ridiculous and stupid story to complement it, albeit potentially sometimes somewhat amusing. The missions themselves tend to be relatively simple. It's generally something in the vein of kill a certain kind of enemy or collect an item, maybe you destroy something by shooting it with a shotgun or something. Things similar to that. And then it depends a little bit of the type of mission, of course. There's like a task board, which are very simple. It's literally just like a bounty quest, basically, right? Kill this enemy or kill these enemies, done. Then there's more like mission-based things that have more of a sequence of tasks with a little bit more story. And then we have the main missions, which usually have the most complex sequence of tasks and the most amount of story as well. So yeah, pretty natural. But they don't encompass any cognitively, intellectually or mentally intensive tasks. It's follow the big quest marker and kill everything that you see. It's not necessarily highly unusual, and it's not like it's a bad thing necessarily. It can be kind of fun and nice to do something that's sort of brainless as well. I'm just clarifying what you're getting. But we are about to run into the only kind of bug or issue that I found with this game. And after that, I am just going to jump into the kind of main mission and show you a little bit of the dialogue and the story and just kind of go through the rest of the things I have to say about this game, which isn't really that much. I've covered most of it already. But anyways, that will finish that guy off and drop a fancy new weapon for us, I believe, which will introduce us to the only sort of bug I found in this game, at least so far, which is this. Yeah. So when you try to hold to pick up and immediately equip an item, the whole bloody game freezes. So that's a thing. It's kind of interesting. It's a rather simple action. I don't see a reason why the whole goddamn game would freeze and forcing you to basically force quit it. But either way, that's what happens. So yeah. There is a rather simple workaround though, which is basically you quickly tap it to pick it up and then you equip it in your inventory. So this only happens when you try to hold to equip. So basically you can't equip something directly from the ground. Again, it's a very minor issue as long as you keep it in mind. It's easy to avoid, but it's also rather bizarre. But anyways, there's no real reason to just sit around here, so I'm just going to jump into the next mission and show you a little bit about what's going on there. So I'll see you in like 1 second. Okay, so we are back. Let's actually start with listening a little bit to the dialogue here first.
So, once we find your dad, we need to chop off one of his body parts.
I can think of a few that could go.
Whew, remind me not to cross you.
Little late for that, isn't it?
Okay, remind me to run the other way once you get your body back.
With pleasure.
So that should give you a little bit of a sense of how the dialogue looks in this game. There's probably going to be a few more dialogue segments that we get in here. But either way, where were we? Right. There's a few more things that's worth mentioning in regards to the levels. They are, as mentioned, rather open, and the amount of variety in the different levels and environments is rather reasonable. So there is a decent amount of different areas, and they are also, as mentioned, relatively large and open. So there's really little likelihood that you'll end up exhaustively exploring an entire level the first time around. There's also supposed to be some sort of pseudo-random generation that plays in. I'm not entirely sure exactly what it does. I would assume it basically sort of remixes the different areas and maybe plot them into different places and connects them in a sort of somewhat random manner. What's very probable is of course that all the different enemies and chests and so on and so forth is randomized. As to the whole kind of level itself, or the layout itself, the layout often comes off as rather similar, I have to say. It doesn't feel like it's substantially different each time you play it, right? It could be certain minor changes, or maybe the kind of bigger areas are sort of randomly connected to each other. So the kind of areas themselves might not have that big changes themselves, but they are connected in different ways and in different positions. This is sort of the impression I got, and it also kind of makes sense because it's a little bit easier and less potentially problematic than generating the kind of environment itself, since obviously in that case, if there becomes problems with the environment, it's gonna be really hard to play. But if the environment already have a kind of fundamental base structure, and then you can generate all the kind of visual details and stuff that doesn't affect the gameplay too much, that would obviously kind of circumvent this potential problem you sometimes see in games with completely randomly generated levels. The kind of drawback is of course that the levels become a little bit more similar and you sort of recognize the different areas after a little while. But I haven't really looked into this that much. I haven't been like making comparative analysis or anything like that, so this is just kind of the impression I've gotten. But yeah, it certainly feels like I am recognizing various areas I've been to previously. At the same time, if a house or a tree is placed in a different position than it was previously, I probably couldn't tell you. But yes, a certain amount of random generation certainly is present. As to just how far that random generation goes, I really couldn't tell you with any kind of certainty. Anyways, while reusing environments isn't necessarily the most exciting thing, considering the overall openness and size of the levels, combined with this kind of pseudo-random generation, I have to say that this is completely reasonable, sensible, and acceptable. Another distinction for the levels is that they often take place on a very elevated position, meaning that there is a lot of risk and prospects for falling deaths. The thing is that deaths in this game, just in general, is taken very lightly and casually. They basically impose a minor cost penalty, just instantly respawn you and off you go. Which is quite common for casual co-op games. One of the bigger ones is of course Borderlands, and that's a game I'm pretty certain this game has taken a fair amount of inspiration from. I can't necessarily empirically prove that, but I think the inspirations are relatively evident, both in mechanics and overall sensibility. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. Borderlands is a good game. It almost certainly also has to do with the fact that it's a rather casual co-op focused game, where you usually don't want to impose excessively punishing or disruptive deaths for the players. Okay, back to levels. The diversity in the levels is, as mentioned, relatively good. The setting itself is in a sort of alternate history, alternate reality China, I suppose. Very much a fantastical, futuristic, and or mythical setting, not at all a realistic setting. But it is very much inspired by Asian architecture and so on and so forth. And of course, not just ancient architecture, but also modern one as well, and kind of like Beijing or Guangzhou or those kind of modern cities and so on and so forth. It's a bit of a mix of different inspirations, I think. The way it works is that each mission takes you to a certain level, which can have radically different environments. So maybe one point you are in a city, and another point you're in like a hell dimension or something like that. So there's a lot of variety in that sense, but they're not necessarily especially interconnected. There's not necessarily a linear progression in respect to where you go, essentially. It's rather similar to, for example, how Painkiller just teleports you to the next level, which can be basically anything. It can be like, oh, you're in a graveyard, and then you are in a swamp, and then you are in an insane asylum, and then you are in a military base, or whatever, right? It really isn't like logically connected, really. It's just a random location which happens to exist somewhere in this world, I suppose. And yes, of course, you do have some kind of mission there, that's a given, but at the same time, it is not like it's not thematically bound in the same way that you would see something like, for example, Assassin's Creed, for example. Okay, everything is probably going to be themed around like medieval environments, right? In this game, it's like, okay, you are in a futuristic city, and now you are in an ancient hell dimension, and now you are in a just standard city. You know, it doesn't necessarily have a very strong narrative through line, coherency, and unity in way of levels and environments, I suppose. Maybe that's the way to put it. But the game also doesn't have a narrative focus, so it totally makes sense, and it's nice to have a wide range of different areas to fight in, so that's pretty cool as well. It kind of depends on what you want to focus on, obviously, you know. When you look at certain games that are more story-driven, they often have a stronger focus on authenticity and, well, narrative cohesion and so on and so forth. In this game, it's more important that you have cool, interesting environments to fight in, right? But anyways, the overall theme kind of takes inspiration from Asian architecture, culture, and sensibilities overall, I suppose. This obviously becomes a very kind of monolithic and generalizing collection of traits and characteristics, obviously, but I think you get the kind of idea at least. So I think we can very quickly cover music as well. It's a rather large range of different kinds of music, actually. It's quite a big difference between, for example, the menu music and the combat musics, let's put it like that. So we basically have metal when it comes to the combat music, and then we have a few segments of more like kind of oriental type of music. And then we have some ambient music, which I'm not even really sure where to place in regards to genre. So I'm actually just going to kind of let you listen to some of it instead, because honestly, I'm not good at explaining music, and I'm not a musicologist or musician in any way. So yeah, I think that's a better way to do it, honestly. So let's do that. Let's start with some combat music, shall we? Alright, and then we can have some kind of menu music. Well, kind of inventory menu to be specific, but anyways, let's go. And finally, just some kind of generic background music when you just walk around and don't really do anything specific and aren't in combat, I guess. So let's go for that. So there we go, that should give you a decent sample of different types of music that we find in the game. It's not especially distinguished or unique from what I can tell, at least not in my opinion. I don't really find it to be exceptionally interesting, but I don't find it to be especially distracting either. It's pretty decent, it works well as background music in my opinion. It's not my favorite type of music, it's not something I would listen to separately personally, but it works well in the context of the game, I would say. But yeah, since I am not like a musical genius or anything like that, I don't really have much else to say about it. Sometimes game music really stands out to me as really good or really unique, which I usually like. In this case, it's not especially unique or interesting, so it's just pretty decent for the most part. It certainly works well and does its job, I would say. So I think the last component that's really left to cover at this point is kind of the story and narrative of the game, which I don't really have all that much to say about, frankly. It certainly isn't the primary focus of the game, it is very much a kind of comedic complementary story to the game. It achieves the purpose of driving you forward and completing the tasks, of course, but it is more so an excuse to get you to different locations and kill a bunch of shit than it is to deliver a story with any kind of deeper meaning, let's put it like that. I would honestly say it's more important that you like the comedy than you actually find the kind of story itself interesting. Now, the comedy is very much hit or miss for me. I think some people will probably like it quite a lot. It is rather immature in nature, and it is, I think an apt comparison would be probably the writing in Borderlands to some degree. It has a rather similar tone, character, and vibe, I would say. And it's also very much a hit or miss when it comes to the jokes in that game, at least for me. Sometimes they are pretty clever and amusing, yeah, and sometimes they are pretty fucking stupid and immature. But yeah, this will obviously very much depend on your sense of humor and what you like and so on and so forth, so, you know. That's kind of why the best way to give you a sense of how it comes off is just to let you listen to some of it, I would say. I mean, it's not particularly funny when you try to explain jokes and comedy anyway, so seems reasonable to me. And considering that the comedy is kind of a core aspect in this case, it's pretty important. But I think that's about what I have to say about this game. So I'm gonna try to have a bit of a summary of the game here and come to some kind of semblance of a conclusion, I suppose. Well, at least a summary and conclusion about what I think about it. And hopefully you would be able to make a determination of whether you would personally enjoy it based on what you've seen. Unless you have already played the game and made up your mind about it and just wanted to listen to someone else talk about Shadow Warrior 2. In which case that's obviously totally fine as well. Anyways, Shadow Warrior 2 is a combat-focused and rather streamlined, casual and forgiving experience, with strong accommodations for co-op gameplay and continuous uninterrupted action. The story is quite silly and ridiculous, deliberately so, delivered somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and mostly serving as a comical and amusing complement to the gameplay. At least that would seem to be the intention. Whether or not the comedy and jokes works for you is of course down to personal preference. The combat is arcadey in nature and very mobile, offering a decent amount of movement abilities and freedom in traversal. Engagement options are however limited to full frontal assault. There isn't any kind of stealth mechanics in the game. The game also offers a rather large arsenal of different weapons of various types, both semi-realistic and fantastical, but which in my opinion varies somewhat in enjoyability. Some are quite satisfying and fun to use, while others fall a bit short and feel rather underwhelming and weak. It also delivers a very solid melee combat, which features a decent range of special attacks and a relatively wide range of weapons that, somewhat unfortunately, feels rather indistinct and mechanically homogeneous in how they act. As a last addition, we have a number of spells and magical abilities, which, in contrast to melee and firearms, more so offers complementary abilities to the combat as opposed to a primary fighting style. The game's gem upgrade system allows for most weapons to remain reasonably feasible throughout most of the game, allowing the player greater freedom in choosing to use the weapon he personally prefers, without any greater consideration for viability in terms of power level. That being said, there still is a certain power rating inherent to the weapon. It's just a little bit less pronounced and determinative than it is in many other looter shooters. The trade-off here is that finding a good gem, in contrast to a new powerful weapon, is less interesting and exciting. With that said, you do of course find a decent amount of weapons as well. It's just a smaller amount relative to many other looter shooters and RPG style of games. Either way, whether or not this is a worthwhile concession is for each to decide for themselves, and will likely depend on who you ask. The levels take the form of relatively large open areas that you can pretty much freely explore at your discretion. Due to their relative size, open level structure, and addition of a certain degree of pseudo-random generation, having multiple missions in the same area doesn't come off as particularly repetitive, at least for the most part. The music isn't bad and serves its purpose well enough, but doesn't really stand out as anything especially exceptional or unique to me personally. The significant shift in genre and style from the previous Shadow Warrior entry is quite noteworthy. And while one isn't necessarily better than the other, it certainly delivers a markedly different experience. And the answer to which is preferable will almost certainly vary depending on who you ask. As a casual co-op looter shooter, it is competent enough and seems to deliver more or less what it aims for. Whether or not this is what you're looking for is for you to decide. But you certainly shouldn't go in expecting anything along the lines of the 2013 Shadow Warrior reboot. That's pretty much it for me though, so with nothing else to be said, maybe I'll see you next time. The game's gem upgrade system allows for most weapons to remain reasonably usable through... What the f***